The moment Hugh Hawkins saw the tears on Eliza Grady's face, standing alone in the dusty yard of her father's ranch with nothing but a broken fence post and an empty corral behind her, he knew that whatever it cost him, he was going to fix this. The year was 1874, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat perched at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man balanced on a fence rail, ready to fall either way. It was a town that had seen cattle drives and dust storms, card games and gunfights, fortunes made and fortunes broken, all within the span of a single blazing summer. The prairie stretched out in every direction like a great brown ocean frozen in place, the grass bent permanently southward by winds that never seemed to stop. This was not a gentle country. It did not forgive weakness, and it did not reward sentiment. And yet, in this place of hard edges and harder lives, something soft and impossible was about to take root. Hugh Hawkins was 26 years old that summer, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with sun-darkened skin and hands that were more callous than flesh. He had been riding the trail since he was 15, following herds north from Texas, sleeping under nothing but stars and whatever scraps of luck he could gather. He was not a man of many words, though when he did speak, people tended to listen. He had a way of looking at a situation that cut straight through to what mattered, and what mattered to him now was the woman standing in the middle of the Grady yard, with her fists clenched at her sides and her eyes red from crying. Eliza Grady was 22 years old, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and a temper that her neighbors described with equal parts admiration and caution. She had grown up on this land, had learned to ride before she could read, had once chased a coyote off her father's property with nothing but a broom and a good deal of righteous noise. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, which was precisely why the sight of her crying now stopped Hugh cold in the road outside their gate. He had only meant to ride through. He was on his way to the saloon to spend the last of his trail pay, a modest collection of coins that amounted to $11.40, which was not nothing and was not everything, and which he had been planning to apply toward a decent meal and perhaps a bath at the boarding house on Merchant Street. He had not been planning to stop at the Grady Ranch. He barely knew the family, had nodded at Eliza's father Thomas Grady at the feed store twice, had seen Eliza herself at the church social last spring and thought then, as he had several times since, that she was the most striking woman he had ever laid eyes on. But he had not spoken more than a handful of words to her, and those words had been entirely unremarkable. None of that history prepared him for what he heard when he reined in his horse at the gate and called out gently, asking if everything was all right. Eliza turned to look at him with an expression that was somewhere between fury and devastation, and she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady, that no, everything was not all right. Her father's horse had been stolen. Not just any horse, she said, but Sovereign, the big bay stallion that Thomas Grady had raised from a foal, the horse that had belonged to Eliza's grandfather before that, the horse that was the last thing of real value the family possessed after 3 years of drought had eaten through their savings like a fire through dry grass. She said all of this quickly, the words tumbling out as though she had been holding them in and the pressure had simply got to be too much. And then she pressed her lips together and looked away from him, as though embarrassed by her own openness with a near stranger. Hugh asked who had taken the horse. She told him it was a man named Deke Sutter, a drifter who had been through town twice in the past month, and who had been sleeping in the Grady barn for the past 3 nights in exchange for work, or so he had claimed. He had evidently done very little work and a great deal of looking around, because that morning he had vanished before dawn along with Sovereign, a good saddle, and a sack of feed. Hugh knew the name Deke Sutter, not well but enough. He had seen the man at the Long Branch Saloon 2 nights ago, a wiry, pale-eyed fellow with a habit of picking at his thumbnail when he was nervous, which he seemed to be always. He had heard from another cowboy that Sutter had a connection to a horse trader who worked out of a camp about 8 miles south of town, A man named Carroll who was known for moving stolen livestock quickly and without much documentation. He sat on his horse for a moment, looking at Eliza Grady, thinking about his $11.40. Then he said he would go get the horse back. Eliza looked at him like he had said he was going to fly to the moon. She told him he did not have to do that she was going to the sheriff. Hugh nodded and said the sheriff was a decent man, but he was also currently dealing with a dispute between two cattle outfits on the north end of town that had gotten loud enough to require his full attention. He said he knew where Sutter was likely headed, and that if they waited for the law to sort itself out, the horse would be gone and gone for good. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse south before she could argue further. The ride to Carroll's trading camp took the better part of an hour through country that was flat and quiet under the noon sun, the only sounds the thud of his horse's hooves in the dry dirt and the distant complaint of a hawk somewhere overhead. Hugh had time to think about what he was doing and whether it was sensible. He concluded that it was not particularly sensible, but that it was the right thing to do, which in his experience were two categories that rarely overlapped perfectly. He found the camp in a shallow draw where a line of cottonwood trees grew along a dry creek bed, their roots apparently finding water that the surface refused to show. There were 3 men in the camp, 2 of whom Hugh did not recognize. The third was Deke Sutter, sitting on a log and picking at his thumbnail with the focused intensity of a man doing important work. And there, tied to a line strung between 2 cottonwoods, was a big bay stallion with a white star on his forehead that matched Eliza's description of Sovereign to the last detail. Hugh rode in slowly, keeping his hands visible and his expression neutral, which was easy enough since his face had always been difficult to read. He addressed the man he took to be Carroll, a heavy-set fellow with a thick beard and a businesslike manner, and he said he had come to buy the bay stallion. Carroll told him the horse was already sold. Hugh asked to whom and for how much. Carroll said that was not his concern. There was a moment of silence in which the cottonwood leaves stirred in a small wind, and Sutter looked up from his thumbnail with those pale eyes that made Hugh think of ice on a winter pond. Hugh said he would pay full market value for a horse of that quality, which he placed at somewhere between $15 and $20 for a stallion in good condition. Carroll said the horse was already sold, and that was the end of it. Hugh looked at Sutter and said, quietly, that the horse was stolen property and that the sheriff of Caldwell was going to know about it before the day was out. What happened next was less dramatic than it might have been. Sutter was nervous by nature, and the mention of the sheriff tipped him from nervous into genuinely frightened. And Carroll was first and foremost a businessman who did not want the kind of attention that a stolen horse accusation would bring to his operation. After a brief and unpleasant negotiation that involved more than one raised voice and a good deal of posturing, the transaction that had occurred between Sutter and Carroll was reversed for $8, and Hugh handed over 8 of his $11.40 and led Sovereign out of the draw by his halter rope, feeling considerably lighter in his pocket and considerably steadier in his chest. He rode back toward Caldwell with Sovereign walking calmly alongside his own horse, and he thought about how he was going to explain to his landlady that he could not pay his week's board until the next job came through, and about whether the cook at the hotel might extend him credit on a meal, and about none of these things quite as much as he thought about the look on Eliza Grady's face when she had told him about the horse. She was waiting at the gate when he came up the road. She must have been watching, or perhaps she had simply been unable to go inside and face her father, who Hugh later learned had been ill in bed for 2 weeks and did not yet know about Sovereign's disappearance. Eliza had been managing the ranch largely on her own during this period, dealing with the neighbors and the accounts, and now this, all while trying to keep her father from worrying himself into a worse state. When she saw Sovereign walking up the road beside Hugh's horse, she put her hand over her mouth and stood very still for a moment. Then she came through the gate at something close to a run, and she went straight to the horse and put both arms around his neck and pressed her face against him. And she did not cry again, but she was quiet for a long time. When she finally turned to look at Hugh, there was something in her expression that was different from what had been there before. The desperation was gone. In its place was something that he could not quite name, something warm and certain and a little frightened, as though she had looked at him and seen something she had not expected to see. She asked him how he had done it. He told her honestly. He said he had found the horse at Carol's camp and bought it back from the man who had taken it there. She asked how much it had cost. He hesitated and then told her $8. She stared at him. She said she would pay him back, that she would find the money somehow, that he could not possibly have spent $8 of his own money on this. He said it was done and she should not worry about it. She said he was a fool. He said probably. And then she laughed, a short surprised laugh that seemed to catch her off guard as much as it caught him, and she looked away from him quickly as though she needed a moment to decide how to handle whatever it was she was feeling. When she looked back, she was more composed, but there was still something there in her eyes that he kept seeing for the rest of the day, long after he had said his goodbyes and ridden back to town. He had $3.40 left to his name, and no immediate prospect of more money and a growling stomach, and none of it bothered him as much as it should have. He rode back through the evening light with the sky going orange and purple behind him and felt, for no reason he could adequately explain, like a man who had done exactly what he was put on earth to do. That evening, Hugh ate a modest meal at the hotel restaurant and paid with the last of his coins, leaving himself exactly 40 cents, and then he walked back to the boarding house where he rented a small room and sat on the edge of his narrow bed and tried to think practically about his situation. He needed work. He had heard that the Bradley Ranch north of town was hiring hands for the fall roundup, and if he rode out first thing in the morning, he could put his name in before the positions were filled. He was still thinking about this when someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find a young boy of about 12 standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, looking up at Hugh with the solemn importance of a person delivering a significant message. The boy said his name was Jacob Grady, and that he was Eliza's younger brother, and that his sister had sent him to find Hugh and ask if he would please come to supper tomorrow evening. Hugh looked at the boy for a moment and then said he would be glad to. Jacob Grady nodded with great seriousness and left, and Hugh closed the door and stood in the middle of his small room with what he was fairly certain was a completely undignified expression on his face. He arrived at the Grady Ranch the following evening at 6 o'clock, which was when Eliza had specified through her brother, and he had cleaned his boots and brushed his good shirt and run a comb through his hair, which was the full extent of the preparations available to him. He brought with him a small bunch of wildflowers he had gathered from the roadside, which was perhaps not the most sophisticated gesture in the world, but which he thought was better than arriving empty-handed. Eliza answered the door herself. She had changed from the work dress she had worn the day before into something in a deep green color that made her dark hair look like polished wood in the evening light. She looked at the flowers and then at him, and something shifted in her face, something soft and quick that she covered almost immediately with a practical expression. She thanked him for the flowers and led him inside. The Grady house was modest but carefully kept, with good furniture that had seen better days and clean white curtains at the windows, and a smell of bread baking that made Hugh's empty stomach respond with enthusiasm. Jacob was at the table already, and Thomas Grady was seated in an armchair near the fireplace, looking considerably better than a man who had been ill for 2 weeks had any right to look. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with a weathered face and the same dark eyes as his daughter, and he looked at Hugh with the frank appraisal of a man who had spent his life judging the character of horses and people, and found the two enterprises not entirely dissimilar. Thomas Grady said he had heard what Hugh had done and that he wanted to thank him properly. Hugh said it had been nothing. Thomas said it had been $8, which was not nothing, and that he intended to pay it back in full as soon as he was able. Hugh said there was no hurry. Thomas said there most certainly was, that a Grady did not leave debts unpaid, and that was the end of that particular discussion. Supper was a fine meal, better than Hugh had eaten in months. Eliza had made chicken and biscuits, and a gravy that deserved more admiration than the conversation allowed time to give it. And there was apple pie afterward that Jacob ate with the efficiency of someone who had not been certain there would be enough. The talk around the table ranged from the weather and the condition of the grass to the cattle drives coming through town, and the news that a railroad spur was being discussed that would eventually end the long trail drives north, which Thomas viewed with mixed feelings since it would change the whole character of the country. Hugh was quieter than usual, partly because he was genuinely interested in listening and partly because he kept catching Eliza looking at him when she thought he was not paying attention, and every time he caught her, she looked away quickly toward whatever else happened to be in her field of vision, and the whole business was making it somewhat difficult to follow the thread of conversation. After supper, Jacob was sent to bed with minimal protest, and Thomas excused himself to rest, citing his continuing recovery, and Hugh and Eliza sat on the porch in the cooling evening air with the stars beginning to appear overhead in that particular way they did on the plains, all at once and overwhelming, as though the darkness had been holding them back and had finally relented. They talked for a long time. Not about anything of immediate consequence, mostly about where they had each come from and what had brought them to this particular corner of Kansas. Hugh told her about growing up in Texas, about his father who had been a rancher until the land gave out, about learning to ride and rope and read the sky and the grass the way other children learned arithmetic. He told her about the trail drives, about crossing rivers in flood and navigating through country that wanted to kill you, and the particular satisfaction of delivering a herd safe to its destination. Eliza told him about being born on this land, about her mother who had died when Eliza was 14 from a fever that came through the county one particularly bad summer. She told him about learning to keep house and look after her father and brother while also learning to manage the cattle and the horses, about the way the drought had chipped away at their savings year by year, about Sovereign and what the horse meant to the family, not just as a working animal, but as a connection to her grandfather who had died before she was old enough to remember him clearly. Hugh listened to all of this without interrupting, which Eliza later told him was one of the first things she had noticed about him, that he actually listened rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. When the night had gone deep and the coyotes had started their distant conversation and the oil lamp on the porch railing was burning low, Eliza said she supposed he should get back to town. Hugh said he supposed he should. Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. When he finally stood and reached for his hat, Eliza stood too, and they were very close together on the narrow porch, and the lamp threw warm light across the side of her face, and he thought with some clarity that he had never wanted to stay anywhere as much as he wanted to stay right here. He said good night. She said good night. He walked to his horse and mounted and rode about 30 yards down the road, and then stopped and looked back at the lit window of the Grady house for a moment before riding on. 3 days later, he started working at the Bradley Ranch. The Bradley operation was one of the larger spreads in the county, running a couple hundred head of cattle on land that stretched north of Caldwell toward the state line. Frank Bradley was a fair employer, not generous but not exploitative either, and the work was hard and honest and kept Hugh busy from first light to well past dark 6 days out of 7. He slept in the bunkhouse with 7 other hands and ate at the long table in the ranch kitchen and spent his Sundays in town, which was the standard arrangement. He began, on those Sundays, to find reasons to ride past the Grady Ranch. He told himself this was because the road past their place was a reasonable route to town, and he was not going out of his way, which was technically true and also not entirely honest. On the third Sunday, he happened to be riding past at the same time that Eliza was attempting to fix a section of fence on the far side of the corral, and since she was clearly struggling with a post that had rotted at the base and was having no success at all in persuading it to cooperate, he stopped and offered to help. The fence took the better part of 2 hours to repair. They worked side by side in the afternoon heat, and Eliza held tools and posts steady, while Hugh drove them into the hard ground, and they talked the whole time with the ease of people who have already gotten past the formal stage of acquaintance and arrived somewhere more comfortable. She made him laugh twice, which was notable because Hugh was not generally thought of as a man who laughed easily, and he noticed that she seemed to be trying to make him laugh, which meant she found it worthwhile, which he found extremely worthwhile in turn. When the fence was done and they were both dusty and satisfied with the work, Eliza brought out a pitcher of cold water and 2 cups, and they sat on the fence rail in the late afternoon shade. Thomas Grady appeared briefly from the house, looking considerably improved from his illness, and greeted Hugh with a warmth that surprised him, and then disappeared again with the tact of a man who understood the situation perfectly. In the weeks that followed, Hugh found that his Sundays had become the axis around which the rest of his week turned. The work at the Bradley Ranch was his livelihood, and he gave it his full attention from Monday through Saturday. But it was the Sunday afternoons at the Grady place that he thought about during the long working hours, the conversations he was going to have, and the ones they had already had that he kept returning to in his memory like a man checking his pockets for something valuable. He and Eliza had a way of talking that felt to him like nothing else in his experience. She was direct without being blunt, curious without being intrusive, funny in the dry, understated way of someone who has spent a lot of time around serious circumstances, and found that laughter was the most effective available response. She had opinions about everything and was not afraid to express them, which occasionally led to vigorous disagreements between them about such topics as the proper way to treat a horse with a stone bruise, the relative merits of different Kansas towns, and whether the increasing presence of the railroad was going to be ultimately good or bad for people who had built their lives around the cattle trail. On this last topic they genuinely disagreed, and the disagreement went on across several Sundays, with each of them gathering evidence and presenting it with what they both recognized was more energy than the topic strictly required, because the arguing itself was pleasurable in the way that things are pleasurable when the person you are arguing with is paying you complete attention. By October the air had a bite in it, and the grass had gone from gold to brown, and the cattle drives had thinned to nothing on the trail, and Hugh found himself one Sunday afternoon sitting on the Grady porch in the cold, clear air, a cup of coffee in his hands and Eliza beside him in a wool shawl, and he understood with the simple certainty of something long known, and finally acknowledged that he was thoroughly and irreversibly in love with her. He sat with this understanding for a few minutes, looking out at the prairie where the brown grass ran to the horizon, and the sky above was the particular pale blue of a Kansas fall, cold and clean and enormous. Then he looked at Eliza, who was watching a hawk riding a thermal in slow circles over the field beyond the fence, and he thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it and whether now was the right moment. He said her name. She turned to look at him and must have seen something in his face because her expression changed, became more careful, more attentive. He said he knew he did not have much. He said he had his wages from the Bradley Ranch and his horse and his gear, and a room in the boarding house in town that he could afford to keep as long as the work held. He said he had been thinking about whether to say this for some time and had concluded that not saying it was worse than saying it and being refused. He told her he was in love with her. The silence that followed was the longest silence he had ever sat in. The hawk kept circling. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. The coffee in his cup steamed in the cold air. Then Eliza set down her own cup very carefully on the porch railing and turned to face him fully, and said that she had been waiting for him to say that for approximately 6 weeks, and that the wait had been considerably less entertaining than he might imagine. He stared at her. She said she was in love with him too, in case that was not completely obvious, and that she had been since approximately the moment she had watched him ride back up the road with Sovereign walking beside his horse, and that she would appreciate it if he did not make her wait another 6 weeks for anything else. He was not entirely sure which of them moved first, but she was suddenly closer to him, and he had taken her hand, and they were looking at each other with the slightly overwhelmed expression of people who have gotten what they wanted and are still adjusting to the reality of it. He kissed her once gently, in the manner of a man who is aware that this is a significant event and wants to treat it accordingly. She kissed him back in the manner of a woman who has been waiting 6 weeks and finds gentleness charming but somewhat insufficient, and what followed was rather more than he had planned for a first kiss, and considerably better. When they finally separated, the coffee was cold and the hawk was gone, and the sun had dropped another hour toward the horizon. Eliza smoothed her hair and picked up her cold coffee and looked out at the prairie with an expression of perfect composure that was undermined entirely by the color in her cheeks. Hugh said he thought he had better talk to her father. She said she thought so too. Thomas Grady received the news with the expression of a man who has been expecting it for some time and is gratified to have his judgment confirmed. He asked Hugh a number of direct questions about his prospects and his intentions, to which Hugh gave equally direct answers. He said he intended to keep working at the Bradley Ranch through the winter, and that he was saving with the goal of eventually having enough to put toward land of his own. He said his intentions toward Eliza were entirely honorable, and that if Thomas would give his blessing, he would like to court her properly. Thomas said he would give his blessing, and that he also still intended to pay back the $8. Hugh said that was perfectly fine. Thomas reached under his chair and produced a worn but serviceable whiskey bottle and poured 2 small glasses and handed one to Hugh, and they drank in the manner of men who have reached an agreement and find the agreement satisfactory. The courtship that followed was conducted in full view of the community of Caldwell, which had opinions about it. The general consensus was favorable, with the reservation, expressed most vocally by Mrs. Clara Bennett of the Methodist Ladies' Society, that Hugh Hawkins was a very decent young man, but that a hired hand's wages were a precarious foundation for a household. Eliza received this opinion with the polite attention she gave to all opinions before proceeding to do exactly what she had already decided to do. They attended church together on Sundays and walked home through the town afterward, which in 1874 in a Kansas cattle town was as public a declaration as anything short of an announcement in the newspaper. They had supper at the Grady Ranch most weeks, and occasionally at the hotel in town on those Sundays when Hugh was feeling prosperous enough to afford it, which was less often than he would have liked but more often than strict financial prudence recommended. He brought her small things when he could: a piece of ribbon from the dry goods store, a book he had found at the second-hand dealer, a collection of poetry that he had never read but which Eliza turned out to love and read to him from on winter evenings in front of the Grady fireplace, while Jacob pretended to be uninterested and Thomas pretended to be asleep. He brought her once a small painted tin brooch he had bought from a traveling vendor, and she wore it on her Sunday dress for months afterward, which he noticed, and which made him unreasonably happy every time. Winter came hard that year, the kind of Kansas winter that means business. The temperature dropped below 0 in January and stayed there for 2 weeks, and the cattle on the Bradley Ranch had to be fed from hay stores and watched for signs of cold weather illness. And Hugh worked longer hours than ever and came home to the bunkhouse at night so tired that he sometimes fell asleep without taking off his boots. But he saved what he could, putting aside every dollar he could manage, because he had a goal now that he had not had before, and goals change the relationship between a man and his money in fundamental ways. In February, during one of the brief thaws when the temperature rose enough for a person to spend an hour outdoors without genuine risk to their health, he and Eliza walked together along the creek road east of town. The cottonwoods were bare and gray against a pale sky, and the creek was frozen solid in the shaded parts and running clear and shallow in the sunny ones, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. Eliza had been talking about something she had read in the newspaper about the conditions on the reservations to the west, and Hugh had been listening and thinking about the fact that the country they walked through had looked completely different 20 years ago, before the great herds of buffalo had been reduced to almost nothing, and the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had lived by those herds had been pushed into smaller and smaller spaces. He said so, and Eliza nodded with the serious attention she always gave to things that mattered, and they talked for a while about what it meant to be building a life on land that had so recently been someone else's, and what obligations that created, which was not the sort of conversation that most people in Caldwell were having in 1874, and which Hugh thought said something important about Eliza's character. She was not naive about it, she told him. She had grown up knowing that this land had been Osage territory before it was anything else, and that the Osage had ceded it under pressure that had not been truly voluntary, and that the fact that her family now lived here did not make the history of how that came to be any less complicated or any less sorrowful. She said she thought the least a person could do was know the truth of things, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Hugh said he thought that was right. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass at the road's edge, and then Eliza stopped and turned to face him in the thin February sunlight and said she had something she wanted to say to him. He stopped too and waited. She said she knew he was saving money and she knew why, and she appreciated it more than she could say. But she wanted him to know that she was not waiting for him to accumulate a fortune. She was waiting for him specifically, and the fortune was a secondary consideration. She said this directly and without any of the circling around that a more cautious person might have employed, and he loved her for it with an intensity that left him temporarily unable to respond. He said he understood. She said good. He said he also had something he wanted to say. She waited. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a small ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it that had cost him 4 months of careful saving, and which he had been carrying in his pocket for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment. He said he knew it was not much. He said he was asking her to marry him. Eliza Grady looked at the ring, and then at him, and then at the ring again, and then she said yes in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely certain, which was the only kind of yes worth having. He put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand up in the thin winter light and looked at it for a long moment with an expression that was beyond what he had words for, warm and private and entirely hers. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and her face against his chest, and they stood like that on the creek road in the cold February air, while the world went about its business around them, which was exactly as much privacy as they needed and exactly as much warmth. The news of the engagement landed in Caldwell with the force of confirmed gossip, which is to say that everyone claimed to have known it was coming, and was delighted to be proven right. Mrs. Clara Bennett revised her opinion of Hugh Hawkins upward based on no new information but considerable social pressure. Frank Bradley at the ranch, when Hugh told him, shook his hand and said he had been wondering when the boy was going to make up his mind, and that he hoped the girl had the sense to say yes. When Hugh confirmed that she had, Bradley nodded with the satisfied air of a man who has just learned that the world contains justice after all. Thomas Grady cried briefly and privately, and then emerged from the house with a very straight back and a firm handshake for Hugh, and told him again about the $8, which he had now managed to save from the small income generated by selling off a few head of cattle. Hugh accepted the money this time without argument, understanding that it was important to Thomas to have given it back, and he put it in his pocket and felt its weight there like a period at the end of a sentence. The wedding was set for June, which gave them 4 months, and which Eliza applied to with the organized energy she brought to everything. There was the question of where they would live, which was resolved when Thomas Grady offered them the use of the small house that had sat empty on the eastern edge of the Grady property since his hired hand had moved on the previous fall. It was not large, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it was sound, and it was near enough to the main house that Eliza could continue to help her father and brother while also beginning her own household. Hugh agreed gratefully, and spent every available Sunday in the months before the wedding making repairs to the small house, replacing boards and fixing the window frames, and building new shelves in the kitchen while Eliza sewed curtains and put together the domestic infrastructure of their future life with what seemed to him like magical efficiency. Jacob helped with the building work and proved to be genuinely useful, which surprised everyone except Thomas, who said the boy had always had a talent for it. The wedding took place on the 14th of June, 1875, on a day that was warm but not yet brutal, with a breeze from the southwest that kept the prairie grass in constant gentle motion. The ceremony was held at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, conducted by the Reverend Aldrich, who was a brisk and practical man who kept his remarks brief and meaningful, which was exactly what the occasion called for. Nearly the whole town came, because Caldwell was still small enough that a wedding was a community event, and because Eliza was well-liked and Hugh had quietly accumulated more goodwill in the community than he was aware of. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been carefully preserved, and which Eliza had altered to fit her own slightly taller frame, and which was a cream-colored silk that caught the light from the church windows in a way that made Hugh, who was not given to poetry, think of words he had heard in the book of poems Eliza had read to him through the winter. She came down the aisle on her father's arm with her chin up and her eyes on Hugh's face, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he was the luckiest man on the Kishom Trail or anywhere near it. When Reverend Aldrich asked if Hugh took this woman as his wife, Hugh said he did with a conviction that would have satisfied even the most rigorous interrogator. When he asked Eliza the same, she said she did in the clear voice of someone who has thought carefully about a decision and arrived at it fully. The celebration afterward was held at the Grady Ranch, with tables set up in the yard and a fiddler from the Long Branch who turned out to be genuinely excellent and who played until the stars were well established overhead. There was food enough for twice the guests, because the women of the community had contributed in the tradition of such occasions, and there was cider and lemonade and dancing on the packed earth of the yard, while the summer night descended warm and fragrant around them all. Hugh danced with Eliza twice, which was all his limited dancing experience would responsibly permit, and she laughed at his efforts in a way that was entirely affectionate and not in the least discouraging. And they stood at the edge of the dancing for much of the evening just watching and talking in the low, private way of people who have all the time in the world and are not wasting any of it. Thomas Grady danced one dance with his daughter and managed not to cry during it, which cost him an effort that was visible on his face and which everyone pretended not to notice. Jacob ate an enormous amount of food and fell asleep in a chair before 9 o'clock and had to be carried to bed by Hugh, who managed this without waking him and came back to find Eliza watching him from across the yard with an expression that he filed away carefully in his memory. They spent their first night in the small house on the eastern edge of the Grady property, with the new curtains Eliza had sewn hanging at the windows, and the shelves Hugh had built full of the things they had been collecting, and the prairie wind moving in the grass outside, and the sound of the last of the fiddler's music drifting from the main house down the road. Life in the first year of their marriage had the quality of something built carefully, brick by brick, with attention to every joint. Hugh continued at the Bradley Ranch through the fall roundup and the winter, and into the following spring, while also beginning to take on additional work wherever he could find it, breaking horses for neighbors and doing skilled fence work on some of the larger spreads north of town. He was good with horses in the way that comes from genuine respect for the animal rather than merely the desire to dominate it, and his reputation in this area grew steadily, as useful reputations do. Eliza managed the small house with the same organized efficiency she had brought to managing her father's ranch, and she helped Thomas with the Grady operation and took on some sewing work for women in town who needed alterations or new garments made, and she kept the household accounts with meticulous care. She was not a woman who found domesticity confining. She found it interesting, in the same way she found all practical problems interesting, as a series of challenges with solutions that rewarded clear thinking and consistent effort. They had disagreements because they were two strong-minded people in close quarters, and that is the nature of things. They argued about money sometimes, in the way that young couples with not enough of it do. They argued about sovereign once, when Hugh suggested selling the horse would bring in needed funds, and Eliza made it very clear in very specific terms that this idea was not now or ever going to be entertained. And Hugh retreated from this position with the strategic wisdom of a man who knows which hills are worth defending and which are not. He privately thought she was right, and the matter was dropped and never raised again. They also had long evenings that were the opposite of argument, evenings when they sat together on the small porch of their house in the cooling air and talked about everything under the darkening sky, about what they wanted their lives to look like in 10 years, and what they believed about God and the land and the way things ought to be arranged in the world. They had reached a point in their intimacy where silence was as comfortable as talk, where either could begin a sentence and the other would know how to finish it, not because they agreed on everything, but because they understood each other thoroughly. In November of 1875, Eliza told him she was expecting a child. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him, and then he took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long time without saying anything, and she looked back at him with her clear dark eyes, and they stayed like that while the oil lamp on the table between them burned steady and warm. He said he was going to be a father. She said she was aware of that. He said he was not sure he knew how to do that properly. She said she was fairly certain nobody did at the start, and that this was not considered grounds for disqualification. He said he loved her. She said she loved him too, and that she also needed him to ride to town tomorrow to fetch the doctor, who she wanted to consult early and regularly. He rode to town the next morning. The pregnancy proceeded without significant complications, which Hugh monitored with anxious attention that Eliza found both touching and slightly exhausting. He built an additional room onto the house through the winter, working in the cold when the weather permitted, which Thomas and Jacob helped with on weekends. The new room was small but carefully done, with a window that faced east to catch the morning light, which Eliza had specified, and a closet that Hugh built himself with joinery that he was quietly proud of. The baby was born on the 5th of July, 1876, in a heat wave that made the whole prairie shimmer like a mirage. He was a boy, solid and red-faced and furiously opinionated about the conditions of his arrival, and they named him Thomas Henry Hawkins, the first name for Eliza's father and the second for Hugh's, who had died in Texas 3 years ago, and whose memory Hugh carried with him with the careful tenderness of something fragile. Thomas Grady, upon hearing his grandson's name, had to go into the back room for a few minutes to collect himself, and came back with suspiciously bright eyes and an extremely dignified expression. Young Thomas, called Tom to distinguish him from his grandfather, was from the beginning a determined and energetic person who approached the world with a combination of curiosity and physical ambition that kept his parents in a state of affectionate alertness from the first months of his mobility. He had Hugh's coloring and Eliza's eyes, and from very early on He had a way with animals that made his grandfather say he was going to be a horseman, which was the highest compliment Thomas Grady knew how to give. Hugh's work had expanded by this point. He had saved enough over the previous year and a half, combined with a fortuitous opportunity when Frank Bradley offered to sell him a small section of land at the northern edge of the Bradley property that Bradley was unable to manage efficiently with his aging workforce, and Hugh had spent 2 weeks calculating and recalculating the figures before sitting down with Eliza and laying it all out on the table. The price was $200. He had 67 saved. The gap was large but not impossible if they were careful, and if he could get a loan from the Caldwell Bank, whose president, a man named Garrett, was known to extend credit to working men with demonstrated stability. Eliza listened to all of this and then asked several extremely pointed questions about the quality of the land and the water situation and the fencing requirements. And when Hugh answered all of them satisfactorily, she said she thought they should do it, and that she would go with him to speak to Garrett, because 2 people making the case were more convincing than one. They went to the bank together the following week, with Tom in Eliza's arms, and they made their case to Garrett, who was a fussy, thin-lipped man of business who was initially skeptical, but who found Hugh's straightforward manner and Eliza's command of the financial details collectively persuasive. The loan was extended at a rate that was not comfortable but was manageable, and they walked out of the bank into the late autumn sunshine of 1876 as landowners, which was a word that settled on Hugh's shoulders like something he had been carrying the whole distance of his life, and had only now arrived at the destination where he could set it down. The land was 40 acres, not large by the standards of the great ranching operations, but it had good grass and a reliable creek and room for growth if growth came. They began building on it the following spring, a proper house this time, 2 stories with a front porch that faced west toward the evening sunsets, which Eliza had specified with the same certainty with which she had specified the east window in Tom's room. Hugh and Jacob and 2 other men from town built it through the spring and summer of 1877, and it was done in September, and they moved in on a Saturday with the help of half the community, which brought food and opinions in roughly equal quantities and stayed until well into the evening. Thomas Grady came to see the house on a Sunday afternoon not long after they had settled in, and he walked through every room slowly and carefully as a man inspecting something of great importance. And when he came out onto the front porch and stood looking west at the sunset, he said it was a fine house, and that Hugh had built it well, and that Eliza's mother would have been very pleased. This was the most significant thing Thomas Grady had said in all the time Hugh had known him, and Hugh understood it as such, and he put his hand on the older man's shoulder for a moment, and they stood together on the porch in the evening light, and did not need to say anything more. The years that followed had the texture of full and busy and mostly good, threaded through with the ordinary difficulties of life in a place that was still defining itself. The town of Caldwell grew and changed. The railroad spur that Thomas Grady had discussed with mixed feelings was completed in 1880, and the cattle trail began its long decline as a route to market, which changed the character of the town and of the country around it with the unstoppable momentum of a weather system moving through. Hugh had seen this coming and had been diversifying his operation away from trail work and toward the settled ranching that would characterize the next era of the region's life. He ran cattle on his 40 acres and leased additional grass from a neighbor to the north, and he continued his horse-breaking work, which had become sufficiently profitable that he was now doing it as a regular enterprise rather than a sideline. He had a reputation for producing well-trained horses that were safe and responsive without having been broken in spirit, and men came from as far as 50 miles away to bring him difficult horses and go home with transformed ones. Eliza had her own enterprises. She had begun selling butter and eggs through the dry goods store in town, and she had expanded the kitchen garden to a scale that produced enough to sell some of the surplus at the Saturday market. She was also part of a small, informal group of women in the community who were working, cautiously and persistently, toward the establishment of a proper school in the county, which currently served children in a one-room building that was cold in winter and sweltering in summer and chronically undersupplied with books. Tom was growing with the speed that children have in the first years of their lives, that sense of almost visible change day by day, and he had developed exactly the relationship with horses that his grandfather had predicted. By the time he was 4, he could sit on Sovereign's broad back under supervision, and the big bay stallion, now considerably aged but still sound and dignified, tolerated this with the patience of a creature that understands its role. In the spring of 1879, Eliza told Hugh she was expecting their second child, and he received this news with the same quiet intensity he had brought to the first announcement, but with more confidence this time, the confidence of a man who has survived one round of something frightening and knows he can do it again. The second child was a girl, born in December of 1879, in a heavy snowstorm that prevented the doctor from arriving in time, and meant that Hugh delivered his daughter himself with guidance from a neighbor woman who had experience with such things, and who remained impressively calm throughout the process, while Hugh was, privately, the opposite of calm. The baby came safely and was small and dark-haired, and looked at the world from the first hour with the considering expression of someone assessing a situation before committing to an opinion. They named her Clara Me Hawkins, the second name for Eliza's mother, and she was from the beginning her brother's devoted shadow and her father's announced favorite, a designation that Hugh denied with insufficient conviction to be believed, and that Tom accepted with the philosophical patience of an older sibling. Thomas Grady held his granddaughter for the first time on Christmas Day of 1879, sitting in the armchair by the fireplace in his own house, and looked at her for a long time in the way he had of looking at important things, and said she had Mary's hands, Mary being Eliza's mother, and this was said softly and without sorrow, as though it were simply an interesting fact. Sovereign died in the spring of 1880, quietly and without distress, in the corral behind the Grady barn, which was where he had lived for the 16 years of his life that Thomas had known him. He was found in the morning lying on his side in the straw, already gone, and Thomas came to tell Eliza and Hugh himself, arriving at their house in the early morning with the news delivered in the manner of someone reporting a death in the family, which it was, in the way that matters. They buried him in the pasture east of the Grady house, which is where Thomas had decided he wanted the horse to be, and Hugh helped with the work, and nobody said much. And afterward Thomas and Hugh sat on the porch of the main house with coffee and were quiet together for a good while, which was the right response, and both of them knew it. Eliza cried privately in the kitchen, and then came out with her chin up and her eyes clear and made them all lunch. And Tom, who had been told carefully about where Sovereign had gone, was solemn and thoughtful about it for several days in the way of children who are processing something too large for the tools currently available to them. Life went on in the way it does, which is to say that it continued to produce both difficulty and beauty in alternating, and sometimes simultaneous quantities. The drought came back in 1881 and hit the county hard, browning the grass and reducing the creek to a trickle and putting pressure on every operation in the area, including Hugh's. They managed it by cutting the herd size, selling off the cattle that would cost too much to feed through the summer, and by the careful use of the reserves that Eliza's precise financial management had allowed them to accumulate. It was lean, but they made it through, and by the following spring the grass came back and the creek recovered and the herd could be rebuilt. Jacob Grady, who was now a young man of 20, had developed into exactly what Thomas had hoped, a capable rancher with his grandfather's instinct for cattle and a mechanical aptitude that was entirely his own. He had begun courting a girl from a family north of town, a sensible and good-humored young woman named Ruth Alcott, and the courtship had the earnest, straightforward quality of two people who know what they want and are not inclined to complicate things unnecessarily. Hugh liked Ruth considerably and told Jacob so, which was the kind of endorsement Jacob valued. In the fall of 1882, there was a meeting at the Grady Ranch that would have seemed remarkable to anyone looking in from outside, though to the people involved it felt entirely natural. Hugh and Eliza sat with Thomas and Jacob and Ruth, who was now engaged to Jacob, around the kitchen table, and they discussed a proposal that Jacob had been developing for some time: the consolidation of the Grady Ranch operation and Hugh's cattle and horse operation into a single concern that would be large enough to be genuinely viable in the changing economy of post-trail Kansas. The idea had merit, and the conversation was long and detailed and occasionally heated, particularly on the question of how the ownership should be structured. Eliza had strong opinions about financial arrangements and made sure they were heard. Thomas had strong opinions about the continuity of the Grady name in the enterprise and expressed them with equal clarity. Hugh said relatively little during the loudest part of the discussion and a great deal during the quiet parts, which was his consistent pattern and which generally produced results. They reached an agreement by evening. The combined operation would be called the Grady Hawkins Ranch, which honored both families, and it would be structured as a partnership between Jacob and Hugh, with Thomas as a senior advisor whose experience and knowledge were formally recognized as a contribution of value. Eliza would manage the accounts, which nobody argued about because everyone present knew she was the best qualified person for this role. The Grady Hawkins Ranch was officially established in the spring of 1883, and the consolidation of resources and the expanded scale of operation immediately made things more efficient. They were able to negotiate better prices with the railroad buyers, were able to maintain a larger breeding herd through lean times, were able to invest in improvements to both properties that neither could have afforded alone. Jacob and Ruth were married in April of 1883, in a ceremony much like Hugh and Eliza's 8 years earlier, with the whole community present and a fiddler and tables in the yard, though the weather was colder, and they had to light fires at the corners of the yard to keep the guests comfortable. Ruth moved into the Grady main house, which had plenty of room now that it was just Thomas in it, and Thomas found that having a daughter-in-law in the house suited him very well, as Ruth was competent and good-natured, and had a talent for drawing him out of the quiet that had deepened around him since Sovereign's death. Tom Hawkins, who was now 7 years old, had become sufficiently interested in horses that Hugh had begun teaching him in earnest, the real work of it, how to read an animal's mood, and what the position of its ears and the tension in its body were telling you, how to make yourself neither threatening nor submissive, but simply present in a way that the horse could accept. Tom was a natural student of this, absorbing information with a speed that made Hugh feel something complicated and proud, the sense of handing something forward. Clara Mee, at 3½ was entirely her own person, and had been since approximately the 2nd week of her life. She had opinions about her clothing and her food, and her position in the household's social hierarchy, that she expressed with a directness that made Eliza see herself in the child with an occasional startling clarity. She followed Tom when he would allow it and invented elaborate games when he would not, and she had already attached herself to a particular young horse in the corral, a gray filly that Hugh had been working with, and visited it every morning with the regularity of a person keeping an important appointment. The spring of 1884 brought good rains and good grass, and a cattle market that was paying decent prices, and there was a period of several weeks in April and May when everything seemed to be operating at something approaching its full potential, the ranch productive, and the family healthy and the accounts in better shape than they had ever been. Hugh found himself one morning standing at the fence of the corral in the early light, coffee in hand, watching Tom work with one of the young horses, the boy's movements already developing the quiet authority that separates the gifted from the merely skilled, and he felt a contentment so complete that it almost frightened him. Eliza came to stand beside him with her own coffee and looked at what he was looking at, and she said it quietly, that Tom was good. Hugh said he was. She said he was going to be better than his father by the time he was 18. Hugh said he sincerely hoped so. She leaned against him in the easy, unself-conscious way they had developed over 9 years of marriage, not needing to make a production of closeness because it was simply the default state between them. He put his arm around her and they stood together at the fence in the morning light while their son moved the young horse in a slow circle, and the prairie stretched out beyond the fence in its early summer green, and the sky above them was enormous and clear and completely their own. He said he had been thinking about something. She waited. He said he had been thinking about that first day, when he had ridden past the gate and seen her in the yard. He said he had almost not stopped. He said he had been on his way somewhere. He could not even remember where now, and something had made him stop, and he had been trying to decide for 9 years whether that was luck or something else. She considered this for a moment, and then said she thought luck was as good a word as any for it. He said he thought she was right. She said she also thought that it had not been entirely accidental, that a man who would spend his last dollars on a stranger's horse was the kind of man who was going to stop when he saw something wrong, that this was simply who he was and the circumstances had revealed it. He said that was a more generous interpretation than he probably deserved. She said she had 9 years of evidence, and she stood by her assessment. He kissed the top of her head and she tilted her face up, and he kissed her properly, unhurriedly, in the manner of people who have an entire future in front of them and know it. Across the yard, Tom carefully did not look at his parents and guided the young horse through another smooth circle. In the summer of 1884, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Warren Tully, who had purchased the section of land to the south of the Grady Hawkins ranch, and who had immediately set about making himself difficult to deal with. The specific problem was a water rights dispute involving the creek that ran along the boundary between the two properties, which Tully claimed he had legal access to at a point that would essentially require him to run cattle through the eastern pasture of the Grady Hawkins operation. This was the kind of situation that in an earlier decade might have escalated into something genuinely dangerous, but it was 1884 and Caldwell had a functioning legal system and a courthouse, and Hugh's first instinct was to go and talk to the man directly and see if there was a resolution to be found before lawyers got involved. He rode over to Tully's property one August morning and knocked on the door and introduced himself and explained the situation calmly. Tully was not a pleasant man, being the sort of person who enters every negotiation from a position of maximum antagonism on the theory that this will get him more of what he wants. He was loud and dismissive and made several remarks that Hugh chose not to respond to, maintaining throughout the conversation a patience that cost him some effort but which he judged to be the correct strategy. He came home and reported the conversation to Eliza and Jacob, and they sat together at the Hawkins kitchen table, and Eliza, who had already done some research in the county records office, spread out her notes and explained that the original survey of the land gave Tully no legal right to the access point he was claiming. She said this with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has read the documents twice and understood them completely. They took the matter to the county court, and Eliza was the one who presented their case with the documentation she had compiled, and the judge, who was a pragmatic man named Carruthers, ruled in their favor after a proceeding that lasted most of a morning. Tully was unhappy about this and expressed his unhappiness loudly in the corridor of the courthouse, and Hugh listened to it without responding, which was clearly more irritating to Tully than any argument would have been. The water dispute was the last significant external complication of that period. Tully remained an unpleasant neighbor but a legal one, confined to his own property by the clarity of the court's ruling, and eventually he sold the land 2 years later and moved on, and the new owners were considerably more agreeable. Thomas Grady's health began to decline slowly in 1885, not dramatically, not in the way of sudden illness, but in the gradual manner of an aging man whose body has been thoroughly used and is beginning to acknowledge the mileage. He remained sharp in his mind and engaged in the life of the ranch in an advisory capacity that was more valuable than its informal nature suggested. But he moved more slowly and tired more easily and spent more time in his chair by the window looking out at the land he had lived on for 30 years. Jacob and Ruth were expecting their first child by the spring of 1885, and Thomas followed this news with an attention that was perhaps the most animated he had been in some time. The baby arrived in June, a boy, named William Thomas Grady, and Thomas held his grandson with the same careful reverence he had brought to holding Clara me 6 years earlier, and said the boy had the look of someone who was going to give his parents a good deal of exercise. This prediction was accurate. Hugh and Eliza had developed a habit, by this point in their life together, of taking a walk together in the evenings after supper, just the two of them, a half hour in the long prairie twilight when the heat of the day had eased, and the light went gold and horizontal across the grass. Tom was old enough to watch Clara me for this period, and took the responsibility with the seriousness of a 10-year-old, who understands that this is an important job. These walks were the space in the day that belonged entirely to them, where the conversation could go anywhere without the practical constraints of the ranch and the children and the accounts. They talked about Tom's future, about whether the county school was giving him what he needed or whether he might eventually benefit from the school in Wichita. They talked about Clara me's character, which continued to develop in the direction of formidable. They talked about Jacob and Ruth and the new baby, and about Thomas's health, and about the changing country around them, the way the railroad had transformed commerce, and the way the open range was being broken up by fences faster every year, the end of an era that Hugh had ridden through in his young manhood and watched closing behind him. They talked about themselves, about who they had been when they met, and who they were now and the distance between those points. Eliza said once on one of these evening walks that she thought love changed shape over time but did not diminish, that what they had now was entirely different from the breathless uncertainty of those early years and not smaller for it, only more settled and more sure. Hugh said he thought she was right. She said she was right quite often and he should note this. He said he had been noting it for 10 years. She said good. They walked on through the golden evening, their shadows long behind them on the prairie grass, and the sound of the ranch settled around them, and the first stars appeared above the darkening horizon, and neither of them had anywhere else they wanted to be. Thomas Grady died quietly in January of 1887, in his bed in the main house, with Jacob and Ruth present and Eliza at his side holding his hand. He had been declining for several months by this point, and the end was not unexpected. And he had been, in his final weeks, entirely at peace, having said what he needed to say to the people he needed to say it to, and arranged his affairs with the orderly care of a man who does not want to leave a mess for others to clean up. Hugh received the news when Eliza came to the Hawkins house in the cold January morning, and he held her while she cried, quietly and completely, the tears she had not allowed herself to shed during the vigil she had kept at her father's side. He held her for a long time and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was better than the saying, and she cried until she was done, and then she straightened and dried her face, and said they needed to make arrangements, and he said yes, and they went together to begin the work of honoring Thomas Grady's life. The funeral was well attended, because Thomas had been in the community for 30 years and was respected by a wide circle of people, and the remarks that were made about him captured the man accurately. Steady, principled, not easy with praise but generous with genuine help, devoted to his children and his land and his horses. The minister read a passage from Scripture that Thomas had chosen himself, which was very much like him, and afterward people gathered at the ranch in the tradition of the community, and filled the house with warmth and food and the particular comfort of shared memory. Eliza inherited the main Grady ranch property along with Jacob, and after a period of discussion, they decided to maintain it as part of the Grady Hawkins operation, with Jacob and Ruth living there and managing it as the family home it had always been. This arrangement suited everyone and gave the property the continuity that Thomas would have wanted. In the months after her father's death, Eliza went through a period of quiet that Hugh gave her room for, understanding that grief works on its own schedule, and that the best thing he could do was be present without requiring anything from her. He was patient with this in the way he was patient with difficult horses, not passive but actively attending, watching for what she needed and providing it before she had to ask. She emerged from this period, as she emerged from all difficult things, with her fundamental self intact and perhaps something added to it, a depth that comes from surviving loss and knowing that you have. She told Hugh one evening in the spring that she thought her father had had a good life, and that she intended to have a good life too, and that she planned to get on with it. He said he was entirely in favor of this plan. She said she knew he was. The late 1880s were prosperous years for the Grady Hawkins Ranch. The operation had expanded to nearly 300 acres between the two properties, running a herd of around 80 cattle, and maintaining a breeding program for working horses that had grown into one of the best regarded in that part of Kansas. Tom was 15 and working full-time with his father, already showing the practical gifts that would eventually make him the primary horse trainer in the operation. Clara Mee was 9 and had annexed the gray filly, now a young mare, as entirely her own project, and had trained her with a patient persistence that made Hugh smile every time he watched it, recognizing in his daughter the same quality that had made him good at the work. Jacob and Ruth had added a second child to their household, a girl named Josephine who was 3 years younger than William and who already had her mother's good humor and her father's determination. The two families operated with the easy interdependence of people who have chosen each other as neighbors and allies, and found the choice entirely satisfactory. On a Saturday evening in September of 1888, Hugh and Eliza celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary with a dinner at the hotel in Caldwell that Hugh had been planning for 2 weeks, and which he considered, privately, to be the most significant occasion in the town's recent culinary history. They sat at a table by the window with a white cloth and actual candles, which the hotel had acquired in their recent renovation, and they ate a meal that was by the standards of the time and place excellent, and they drank a glass each of very decent wine, which the hotel had also acquired, and they talked across the table with the particular pleasure of two people who are never more at home than when in each other's company. Eliza had worn the deep green dress again, the one she had worn at their first supper, which she had kept and maintained, and which still fit her because she was still fundamentally herself, unchanged in the ways that mattered, though of course marked by the years in the ways that life marks everyone. She had her dark hair pinned up with the small garnets that Hugh had given her for their 5th anniversary, and in the candlelight she looked to him precisely as she had always looked, which was to say beautiful in the specific way of someone who has been deeply known and is only more beautiful for the knowing. He said so. She looked at him across the table with those dark eyes and said she was going to keep him. He said he was relieved to hear it. She said he should be. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it there in the candlelight, and they sat like that for a while, not needing to fill every moment with words, comfortable in the warmth of the restaurant and the evening and each other. He thought about the day he had ridden past her gate. He thought about the $8 that had turned out to be the most important money he had ever spent. He thought about $11.40 and the calculation he had made that day without quite realizing he was making it. The calculation that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with a woman standing in a dusty yard with her fists clenched and her eyes red, and a kind of fierce sorrow about her that had reached right through him and demanded a response. He thought about all the Sundays since then, the evenings on the porch, the arguments about fence rails and railroad policy, the nights when the wind came hard off the prairie and they lay awake listening to it together, the mornings when he woke early and lay still in the gray light watching her sleep and thinking that the world was arranged, in at least this one fundamental respect, exactly as it ought to be. He did not say any of this out loud, because he did not have the words for all of it in a form that could be delivered across a candle-lit dinner table without sounding like something from one of Eliza's poetry books. And besides, he thought she knew. He thought she had always known, in the way that two people who pay close attention to each other know the things that are too large to be said directly. She was looking at him with a small smile, as though she was following the general direction of his thoughts without knowing the specifics. She said quietly that she never forgot it. The horse. The $8. The way he had just turned his horse and gone, without making a speech about it or waiting to be thanked, just gone to fix something that needed fixing because that was who he was. He said he had not done it to impress her. She said she knew that. She said that was why it had impressed her. He looked at her across the table and thought he could spend another 40 years in her company and not come to the end of what there was to discover. He said he thought he had better order dessert. She said she thought so too. They rode home through the warm September evening with the stars out in their full prairie abundance, the horse walking easy on the familiar road, and the ranch came up out of the dark ahead of them with the lamp in the window that Tom had left burning, and the barn quiet and the house solid and permanent on the dark land. And Hugh brought the horse to a stop for a moment outside the gate, and Eliza turned to look at him in the starlight. She asked what he was looking at. He said their home. She looked at it too, the house he had built with his hands, the land they had claimed together through years of hard work and careful tending, the barn where their horses stood in the dark warmth, the lamp in the window their son had left burning, the whole of it a thing they had made together from the raw material of chance and will and love. She said it was a good home. He said it was. And then he clicked to the horse and they went in through the gate, and the evening closed around them, warm and complete and utterly their own. And there was nothing left unfinished in the world that mattered to them that had not been tended to, and nothing ahead of them that they could not face together. And everything that had begun on a dusty road with a crying woman and a stolen horse and $11.40 had arrived, improbably and perfectly, precisely here. Tom was already asleep by the time they came inside, and Clara Mee was in her room with her lamp still burning, reading the same poetry book that had been in this family since before she was born, passed from Eliza's hands to hers in the way of important things. She called out good night when she heard them come in, and they called back, and Hugh checked the doors and Eliza turned down the lamps, and they went up together in the quiet house with the sound of the prairie wind outside and the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. And everything was as it should be and would continue to be. The love between them not a finished thing but a living one, still growing in the patient way of things rooted deep, shaped by time and tended by choice, and as certain as the land beneath their feet.